Thanks everyone for joining. This is the latest in stories, and in case you don't know me, my name is Jon Newmuis. I'm the facilitator of the working group for stories in AMP, and I lead the team at Google that works on the stories format and the greater stories ecosystem in AMP. And today I just wanted to talk to you about some of the bigger focus areas that we've been working on as the stories working group over the past several months and where we stand today. So first, I wanted to give some context around sort of what the stories working group is. And our mandate from AMP's technical steering committee reads that the stories working group is responsible for implementing and improving AMP story format, which is the AMP story component. And I think perhaps this is a little bit understated, not just because the AMP story component itself is huge and complex and gnarly in a number of different ways, but also because we really focus not just on the format code that's committed to the AMP repository, but really the entire stories ecosystem. It's a whole ecosystem of different parties. So it is all reliant, of course, on the format, but there's also tools to create stories that are an important part of the ecosystem. We've found, maybe this isn't a huge shocker, but we found that nobody wants to like create stories by writing HTML by hand, right? So these tools exist to sort of be that middleman, and so they're an important part of the ecosystem. Of course, advertisers and the AMP ads working group, publishers, and obviously the end user. So there are a lot of different parts of really this whole ecosystem that come together to make stories work for the user. And really, I view our responsibility to sort of shepherd that ecosystem into a good place. So perhaps one example of this is how we've been thinking of the distribution of stories. So last April at AmpConf 2019, we demoed what was new at that time, the browsing experience for stories on mobile web from Google Search. And that experience looks something like this, where on a search results page, you see a number of stories, and you can pick whichever one seems most interesting to you. Then once you do, you sort of dive into this full bleed immersive experience where you can tap through the story that you're on. And if you want something else, you can just sort of swipe and you'll just jump right into the next story, right? So this is a great consumption experience in Google Search. But when you think about it, there's nothing really specific to Google Search here, right? Like you want to view a couple of stories and be able to browse between them. That does apply to Google Search, but it could also apply to other surfaces. So over the past few months, we've been building out an open source library that we call the AMP Story Player that replicates this functionality on the open web. And this is available now for folks to start using. What you're seeing on the right is the AMP Story Player, which, as I said, provides this functionality of being able to tap through stories, and then when you want a different one, you can swipe to another one. The open source version of the Web Story Player or AMP Story Player allows also the option of whether you would like to load a story from your own domain or whether you would like to load it from an AMP cache, and if you would like to load it from an AMP cache, which AMP cache you would like to load it from. And that, of course, I mean, AMP caches provide a number of performance benefits, but this is especially true for stories where there are additional optimizations that we make for story-specific cases. The player also allows you to use any implementation you like for the recommendations. So right now, what we support is basically a static list of stories, but we are in the process of adding, or maybe it's landed, not entirely sure the status there, but it's about to land, the ability to load stories dynamically into the player, where you can, you know, use whatever custom JavaScript you want on your own site to populate these things into the player. The player also allows you to build your own platform functionality on top of stories. So if you want to have some sort of different navigational structure than what stories natively support, not for browsing the content itself, but for example, browsing your site hierarchy or something like that, right? Some folks want to have an X button to be able to like go back to some other page. Some folks want to have menus or, you know, whatever it might be. You can build that type of thing. You could also build additional features on top of the story player, such as the ability to like favorite a story or something like that. Whatever feels right in your platform. And so we're currently working on extending the player to allow for more advanced configuration and better programmatic support to provide all the JavaScript hooks to be able to create the experience that you desire. What you're seeing on the left is what we call entry points. And we're also looking to build out a set of these where, you know, this is an example of a grid of stories, but you could imagine any number of, like, a carousel of stories, you know, it can be any arbitrary UI, but we're looking to, you know, sort of set the right best practices and really have first class primitives for this as well. And so, you know, this is all outside of the AMP core code base, really, right? This is something that you can embed directly in your other pages, like non-AMP pages as well. And so this is, again, I guess one way of looking at how this differs or extends beyond just sort of maintenance of the AMP story web component itself. And, you know, the other aspect here is that we're considering building this directly into the web share functionality of stories, so that, you know, just like now, if you go to a YouTube video or a tweet or whatever, in the YouTube UI or the Twitter UI, they will have a place that says like copy and paste this embed code if you're looking to, you know, put a YouTube video on your blog, et cetera, et cetera. And we can do the same thing in stories here, right? If you were to tap the sharing icon that you see at the top right corner of the story on the right, we can provide an embed code snippet directly in there that you can just copy and paste into your blog or site. Cool. So I am going to attempt a live demo. Fingers crossed. And the reason I want to do a demo is to provide insight into another way of potentially using these the story player. So this is a fake recipe, and just directly in line in the recipe, you can just sort of embed a story that is, you know, about that recipe or something like that, right? And so this is tackling a number of issues at once, right? One is this potentially provides a better user experience, or at least a different user experience. Folks can, you know, choose to consume this in whichever way they want, you know, and sometimes reading the text version is a good thing. But as you are actually doing it, maybe you want to have stories with this sort of like paginated nature, could potentially be good for, you know, doing this actually well, like consuming the recipe while you're actually cooking the crispy chicken thighs in this example. The other thing that it does is, you know, the web stories ecosystem is still nascent, and the advertising ecosystem in web stories is still nascent. So this allows you to embed a story in a page that otherwise is already monetized, right? And the benefit there is that, you know, sometimes folks have this question of, do I create an article? Do I create a story? Like, how do I know when to create which one? This sort of lifts the burden of monetization off of the story format itself, right? If you want to place this in a page that is already monetizing, you don't have to replace that page with a story. They can just sort of coexist side by side. And so this example is actually pretty easy to create. I mean, I've stripped out a lot of the stuff that's unimportant, but you know, it's basically just a single tag that you can place directly in your page, and would also be one script import that you put at the top of your HTML page. But basically, it's just a link to the story wrapped in this AMP story player tag, and you can size this block element however you like. You can put stuff around it, put stuff on top of it, et cetera, et cetera. It works just like an iframe or an HTML block element. So we think this is really a powerful tool to be able to have. But one other way that you can use it is to still use the story full bleed. This is our full bleed, our desktop mode, our desktop presentation of stories. And here this is being used, the player is being used to provide additional functionality on top of the baseline functionality of the story. And so I've just written some basic HTML and JavaScript to implement my own custom sidebar menu on top of this story. But a sidebar menu is completely just an example. You could really use this this functionality to do whatever you want on top of the story, right? Like the story exposes a number of API hooks to be able to play and pause the story, be able to mute and unmute the story, change pages, etc. And so you could build functionality to control the story. The story also exposes a bunch of events like the page has changed, or the user has arrived at the end of the story, etc. And so you can also conversely use those triggers from the story to control things on the rest of your site. And this is also very straightforward. Again, just embedding the story, in this case, 100 VW and VH so that it's full screen. And then I just wrote some custom JavaScript that just, implements this sidebar menu button and the mask overlay. But that's all, custom to my site. Cool. So those are the two demos I wanted to run through. Another big area of investment for us has been video playback. And video playback is interesting. Backing up for a second, I guess this diagram should hopefully be obvious to folks that web stories come at the intersection of the web platform and the stories format. And both of these things predate web stories, right? So looking at other stories formats for a second, most of them reside either in social apps or native apps or both. And this generally allows them to do intelligent prefetching of video assets to sort of minimize that time to first byte on the video. And that's just an advantage that we don't always have with web stories. On the other side, on the web platform side, if you look at video platforms on the web, most of them serve longer form video, right? And so the advantage that they have there is, maybe I'm willing to wait as a user, I'm willing to wait 4 seconds to, watch a 10-minute YouTube video. If it takes 4 seconds for the video to load, maybe that's fine. But in the stories format, videos are closer to 10 seconds than 10 minutes, right? And so waiting 4 seconds for a 10-second video to load is not necessarily a great user experience. So put another way, I guess, like the user isn't changing their expectations. The user honestly probably doesn't care about the implementation detail that this is on the web. they enjoy the perks of it being on the web, like the fact that these stories are inherently searchable, they're inherently shareable on whatever medium that you like, and not tied to necessarily any specific platform or app. But they don't really change their user expectation. They want these stories to function the way that like native app stories work, right? And so I consider it to be also within the scope of the mandate of this working group to basically fill that gap collectively across the ecosystem, from the creation tools to the amp caches and the format. Like, we all need to work together to iterate and consistently improve in this space. So this is a very, very large focus area for us, and just want to dive in a little bit on what we've been doing there. So we're updating AMP video to allow publishers to specify multiple bit rates. So this is for the same video, you can provide multiple different bit rates. I guess if you're not familiar with the concept, the closest analog I would say is if you imagine something like the YouTube player, there's like a button at the bottom that lets you select, do you want 1080p or 720p or 480p or whatever. And that type of selection can happen manually, or it could happen automatically, and I think there are benefits to both. But it does become clear that we should have at least some way of being able to do that type of adaptive bitrate selection. And in our testing, we've identified some issues with existing adaptive bitrate formats like HLS and MPEG-Dash. For one, MPEG-Dash, like neither of them have like perfect browser support. And so you always will need to specify your video in at least some other fallback format, because the polyfills for each of them are quite large, and it doesn't necessarily make sense to load a bunch of JavaScript just to play the video. And so, but there are also other benefits as well. So this is something that we're hoping to invest in sometime soon. Another optimization we can look at is expanding the amount of server-side processing that we do, either through AMP caches or the AMP toolbox optimizer. And for certain types of stories, you know, it could be better to stitch multiple videos together and sort of artificially delineate that video in the UI. And for other types of stories, it can be beneficial to use lower bit rates on some of the videos to get a faster initial playback. And in pretty much any case, we can explore newer, more modern formats than the H.264 format that is sort of the, I guess, bread and butter of what we've seen so far. So we've seen a lot of promise in VP9 and H.265, and we're going to be diving in there and see if there are any recommendations that we can make for caches to use to transcode their video. But speaking of recommendations, the other thing that we can do in this space is to provide a wider set of publisher best practices around video performance, so that publishers are aware of what they should be doing. And I think that's not entirely clear right now, but we're working to, you know, in all of this exploration that we've been doing, I think there are a set of best practices that can be distilled from this, where we can you know, let publishers know, for example, what bit rates they should be targeting and what codecs they should be targeting. So, as I said, this will always be sort of an ongoing area of work for us. Performance is never really something that's just solved, I guess, right? It's always something that can be made better, and we will continue to work to do so. The other thing that I wanted to touch on is sort of how we've been working to create more immersive experiences. I think this is more classic format work, I guess. And so, sorry, this slide doesn't seem to be rendering super well. But to pick up where we left off, video has, you know, it's not just the performance aspects of video that we care about, but also the, like, what it does to help aid the storytelling. And video is just a great way of keeping users immersed in stories. Not this video. The way this is rendering is not particularly immersive, but you know, one of the areas we've been investing in is building out support for 360 videos and stories. We built a couple of prototypes on Video.js using the Video.js VR extension, and they feel really, really great. It's so easy to discover as a user because you're never really holding your phone still. So when you end up on a page of a story that has a 360 video on it, you just kind of naturally realize that you can look around, and it's a great experience. The fallback is also great because if your phone, for example, doesn't support gyroscope or you've disabled it, it still feels natural. The video will still play through. You'll just be looking at one fixed point in the video, and it just feels like a regular story. So it's a graceful degradation and a really good one at that. And so we've been folks on the stories working group have been working with expert contributors from outside the working group, working together to sort of productionize some of the prototyping that we've been doing. And we hope that we have more to share there soon. We've also been working to make stories feel more interactive and alive by implementing a set of interactive components. So the first one is this sort of quiz component where users can vote on a quiz and you know, see whether what they've answered is correct or not. The second one is this more subjective poll style component where you can vote for something that doesn't necessarily have a right answer, although the right answer here is cats, I must say. And, you know, we're looking at what else we can do in this space. But these interactive components generally all work the same way, where they make XHRs to a publisher specified backend that can help to aggregate quiz and poll data. And we're working with folks across the working group to make sure that we have sort of stable drop-in options for backend endpoints so that if you don't necessarily want to stand up your own backend, you don't have to. So hopefully this has been interesting. If you are interested in getting more involved, you can always join the Stories Working Group meetings. We meet about once a month, and all the details on the working group can be found at bit.ly/wg-stories. And, you know, there's no commitment or anything, but, you know, you can show up and we talk through these issues, and that's how a lot of the stuff that was just presented made its way here. A lot of those decisions and a lot of the groundwork of figuring those things out happen in the working group meetings. So we've yet to schedule the one for July, but if you go to that bit.ly link there, bit.ly/WG Stories July 2020, we currently have are asking folks about their availability. There's a link to a Doodle calendar where you can denote your availability if you'd like to be included in the meeting. And if you want to get started building stories, you can check out, I mean, like I said earlier, most folks tend not to want to build these things by hand. So if you're looking for a drag and drop editor, a WYSIWYG editor, you can go to bit.ly Web Stories Tools, which provides a list of these stories. Or if you do want to try to build these by hand, or if you are yourself building a tool, You can always check out the documentation and code samples and tutorials at amp.dev/stories. So thank you, everyone. I don't know if we have time for questions. I think we're actually a little bit over. But you can always either send me a message in the chat, or if you, if you go back to the bit.ly WG stories link here, there are instructions on how you can find our Slack channel, and you can talk to us on Slack.
Great, thanks, Jon. That was a great talk, and stories is, as usual, pretty exciting. I don't feel too invested. I've had cats and dogs both through my life, so I think they're equally great. I would have difficulty with that poll, but it was very brave of you to go out on a limb and say that the correct answer was cats. And Pratik is mentioning that Make Stories 2.0 was launched to the public today, so that's great news. I think there's like a pretty good ecosystem being created around web stories, which is all really great to see.